Theodorakopoulos is a classicist at the University of Birmingham, UK. She specializes in Latin poetry and in the reception of Greek and Roman literature and culture in modern and contemporary literature. She is the co-editor of Homer's Daughters, Women's Responses to Homer in the 20th Century and Beyond, and she has published recently on Barbara Kohler, Anne Carson, and Laura Riding. So I am delighted to turn the podium over to Jonahs.
We're going to just check the technology.
It will work. It's only a PowerPoint. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honour and it's very, very exciting. And I'm going to start by doing what my supervisor always told me not to do. He always said, never apologise, never explain. I'm going to apologise and explain. So as a newcomer, and I think probably an interloper to the MLA and to the Robert Graves Society, I want to begin by explaining very briefly how I got here. So I am a classicist, and it was lovely to be reminded of how Tolkien became a classicist actually at King Edward's, which is just across the road from my university in Birmingham. So a nice little reminder of home. I'm a classicist, and my interest in classical reception has focused on women's writing of the 20th century, and that brought me to Laura Riding, and to her Trojan ending, and thence to Graves and his take on the classics. And I've been very interested in his quite idiosyncratic interpretations of classical myth and literature. And I've also been intrigued by his interest in ancient matriarchies. And I'm really interested in how this intersects with Laura Riding's thinking about women as people and about women as myths and women and myth. So that's, in a sense, the background through which I came to this. So then I saw this call for papers in the 1960s, about which I know absolutely nothing, as will become very clear shortly. It occurred to me that it would be really useful to take a closer look at the ways in which Graves makes use of classical myth in his love poems, and into how the love poetry intersects with the Muse mythology developed in the White Goddess. So the paper is sort of in two parts. The first part is looking at more at the 60s and the idea of the Muse and trying to contextualize that a little bit. And the second part, I'm looking at two poems about the Orpheus and Eurydice, or using the Orpheus and Eurydice myth and trying to work out what he's doing there in relation to Virgil. So I'm not entirely certain, and this is the apology part, that the two parts of the paper entirely fit together, but we shall see. So the period that we're looking at, that I've decided to focus at, is from around 1960 to 1965, which obviously includes the time of Graves's lectures as Professor of Poetry at Oxford, and includes a focus on love poetry, often connected in the biographies to his relationship with Margaret Callas, in this case, I think, referred to as his muse of the time. And in fact, I was looking at the recent fictionalized autobiography by one of Graves's grandnephews, which evokes Callas, referred to as his muse, which evokes Callas in quite a vivid manner. And I just, in fact, was rather struck by the language here. This is upon first seeing her. Nothing more than the illusion of someone, her slender body molten in the sunlight. I mean, I'm not judging the prose, but I am judging the prose. But what I think is interesting here is this. This is a real person, and this is supposedly documenting a meeting with a real person. But she is already, in this first meeting, kind of turned into an image, into a myth, dark hair, clouds of it. The abstraction is very interesting. He later on in the book has quite a fun exchange with the woman herself, and asks. So he's a boy, he's a teenager, and he's really interested in the idea of the muse, and asks her straight out, "What does a muse do exactly?" Which of course is what we all want to know, right? Why she amuses herself, of course. She had to make that joke. Anyway. That's just by way of background. So this is also the time, though. So this time evoked in this book, for example, and elsewhere, of course, is the time during which the second wave feminists begin to make themselves felt and heard, and the publication of Betty Friedan's *The Feminine Mystique* in 1963 caused considerable waves and ensured that ideas about gender as a social construct, which had been introduced in The Second Sex, of course, in 1949, became much more widely debated and known in the Anglophone world. And I feel that in this context, Robert Graves's apparent championing of the power of women makes quite an intriguing addition to the mix. So, for instance, in the Ladies' Home Journal for 1964, we find in the issue that it was a special issue on My Fair Lady, which is probably they were more interested in that than in the Robert Graves issue, which is why the cover is what it is. Anyway, in that special issue, there was also, this is the January 1964, Robert Graves on the topic of the real woman, and doing a little bit of what we might today call mansplaining on the subject of how to be a real woman. And then 6 months later, again, Ladies' Home Journal, June 1964, we had a special issue focused on Woman, the Fourth Dimension, with a follow-up essay by Betty Friedan on the best-selling Feminine Mystique. What was a girl to think then in 1964 about how to be a woman? Friedan was telling women that it was indeed possible to break out and away from the three dimensions of wife, mother, homemaker, and to have a fulfilled life. Graves was telling readers of the Ladies' Home Journal that a man's biological function is to do, woman's is to be. And the elaboration of it, this sounds unkind, I'm not being unkind. Forgive me, but it's too good to. And the elaboration of what this being involved sounds like a somewhat worrying mixture of the bohemian and the bourgeois, which slightly reminds me of what you were talking about. For instance, a real woman's main concern is her beauty, which she cultivates for her own pleasure, not to ensnare men. Right? But also, a real woman is content to dress with a difference, to make her home unmistakably her own, to illuminate any company she enters, to cook by instinct, not by the cookery book. This is her evidence of being, the proof of which lies in her sense of certitude. She is no feminist. She's right. So there's a lot of domesticity going on here. There is more, and I am not citing all of this to be unkind, but simply to give a sense of the time. What does disturb a 21st century reader, however, is the way in which the essay ends. It ends by evoking Jennifer Dawson's 1961 novel, The Ha-Ha. This is a novel about a young woman's mental breakdown. And Graves says that mental institutions on both sides of the Atlantic house hundreds of young, beautiful, silently brooding girls, victims of the sex war, defeated before they could come to terms with life. I find it hard not to think of Sylvia Plath in this context. Presumably she was not, in Graves's view, a real woman. As he says, a real woman somehow avoids suicide, or virtual suicide, or the mental institution. This is not worthy of me, she will remind herself 10 times a day. that to preserve my inner self, I must once more act an alien part. I have to wonder whether he was aware that the part of Muse was itself such an alien part. Now, to return to the subject of Graves's love poetry, it's perhaps a little bit mischievous of me, but I hope forgivable, if I set the scene a little with the poem Old Man in Love by the poet Ruth Fainlight, who was a friend of Robert and Beryl Graves. I'm sorry about the quality of the image, but I just took it from the book. So, Old Man in Love, the goods accrete as he gets older. Land, children, fame, he's weighted by a lengthening list of things that name him. Tethered, firm to age and death. The work left to complete, like secret money he can draw on, might help escape, but surer still, he hopes, is anguish, severance. He seeks destruction in the gaze of love. Now, this looks to me like a clear-sighted assessment of Graves's insistence on seeking to suffer in love into old age. In an interview published in the Graves Review in 2017, Ruth Fainlight apparently refusing to be drawn on what, very, very diplomatically refusing to be drawn, I think, on what the interviewer refers to as Graves's quite complex set of prejudices, thoughts, intellectual positions around gender. She simply observes about man as woman is, I found that really infuriating. And that's all she says. I expect she was not alone in not being entirely convinced by the Gravesian muse worship, and certainly not the only woman poet to be unpersuaded by the desirability of musedom, as he described it. But Fainlight and her friend Sylvia Plath were drawn to the White Goddess, and it appears that both may have seen the partnership between Graves and Riding as a model for their own marriages with important writers. But how could they have reconciled themselves to the pronouncement that woman is not a poet, she is either a muse or she is nothing? Of course, in a sense, Plath did not reconcile herself to that, and by 1964, when Man Does, Woman Is was published, she was already dead. My paper today is an attempt to understand how that volume, Man Does, Woman Is, and more generally Graves's dramatising of the vicissitudes, such a hard word to say, of love, sit within the context of a world in the early to mid-1960s in which women poets did exist, quite patently, and were trying to work out how to be women, maybe real women, and poets. Now, Laura Riding had renounced poetry herself by this time, but her poems were read on the BBC's third programme in 1962, when Plath, of course, heard them, and there was a new edition of selected poems published in 1970 by Faber. Now, I have, a little provocatively, given a title to my paper which alludes to what Laura Riding says in one of the essays in Epilogue about the ways in which men think about women. And I did this because I think that her perspective on the man-woman relationship is significant, despite the fact that she no longer featured in Graves's daily life in the 1960s. Although by all accounts, her presence, I think, was still felt in the house in Mallorca. Riding had, as you all know, written a lot about women and about the way that men and women relate to each other. And she was, like Graves, interested in the idea of an ancient, perhaps also a future, supremacy of women. On the White Goddess, her antipathy is well known, and she claimed in the foreword to The Word Woman, published posthumously in 1993, that everything produced by Graves, quote, in this guise of male pioneer in new thinking on woman and women, is derived appropriatively from my thinking, as he had direct personal contact with it, end of quote. And that, quote, the literary production in which Robert Graves exploited my thought and writing on the subject of women most massively and concentratedly is The White Goddess, end of quote. These claims are, of course, contested by many, and it is not my objective here to defend or to prove them, merely to bring them into the mix in order to suggest that Laura Riding's work on women has some bearing on the period of the 1960s, in which the currency of the White Goddess was riding high, and the role of the incarnated muse was taken on by a series of women who were often seen to be following in the footsteps of Laura Riding herself. Now, Laura, of course, was described by the poet Randall Jarrell in 1956 as the White Goddess incarnate, the mother muse in contemporary flesh. Elizabeth Friedman, Laura's biographer, tells us, however, that Laura knew nothing about the Muses of the period, so I am not in any way suggesting that her comments have anything to do with that. It is worth noting, however, that Laura Riding had expressed her views on the abstract idea of the muse, quite separately from Graves's personal muse mythology and its adherence to her own person. For instance, in the preface to Collected Poems of 1938, where it is quite clear that she considers the muse an invention, a myth, a lie, in her words, and thus inimical to the aim of truth in poetry. And I've just, I'm not going to read this out because I think I might run out of time. Put that on here. Now, so that may also, I think, have some bearing on how we think about the idea of these incarnated muses. And I want to move now to the second part of this paper. And against the background and the context that I've outlined, I want to take a look at just a pair of poems in Man Does Woman Is, in which the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice is used in a particularly intriguing manner. And this is just the standard 5th century depiction of Orpheus leading Eurydice out of the underworld. And it will, I hope, become apparent why this matters. I might miss something. Well, if I had more time, I would want to talk a bit more about how the idea of woman is developed in the collection and how it is connected with the turning of women into myth. For instance, in poems such as At Best Poets, where the equation between woman and nature is effortless and elegant in the first line. Woman with her forests, moons, flowers, waters. Or the or an interesting line in the ample garden. But I will move on. I'll move on to Eurydice because I fear I have overestimated the time. Now, in Greek myths, I find it initially striking that Graves is entirely uninterested in Orpheus as a poet. And he makes some really interesting remarks there about Eurydice's victims dying of snakebite that are also rather curious. So against that background, if we have a look at Food of the Dead, here is the pomegranate, and obviously the person holding the pomegranate is Persephone. The thing that strikes me the most in this poem, Food of the Dead, is the conflation of Persephone, the queen of the underworld, traditionally, with Eurydice. Now, the latter's, Eurydice's presence, is obviously implied by the naming of Orpheus, but Eurydice has nothing to do in Greek myth with the pomegranate seeds, either in Greek or in Roman myth. The seeds are offered by Hades to Persephone, and the choice that the girl makes to eat them means that she must commit to becoming the queen of the underworld. Now, the eating of the seeds is often interpreted by modern readers as a form of assertion of agency, sexual agency, by which the kidnapped girl, Persephone, establishes herself as independent from her distraught mother. So, for instance, there is a series of poems by Rita Dove in which that is worked out really, really nicely. But it's also something that most readers of Greek mythology would accept. And the business about the eating of the seeds is made quite clearly into a matter of assertion of independence as early as the Homeric hymn to Demeter, but far less emphatic of its version, for what it's worth. Now, in his Greek myths, Graves calls the seeds the food of the dead, so that clearly takes us back to the title of the poem. And he expands here on a theory, well, call it a theory or a fiction, that there was a primitive taboo on red-coloured food, which could only be offered to the dead. In The White Goddess, Orpheus is not mentioned at all in connection with Eurydice. In fact, Eurydice doesn't appear at all in The White Goddess, but he is mentioned as a victim of the White Goddess. So back to the poem. So in the poem, I think the woman, or goddess, she, has eaten, is in something of a habit of associating with the dead, I think, according to the poem, because she has again eaten the seeds. This is a repeated action. Then she once more warms the serpent at her thighs for a new descent into hell. So it appears, I think, that in Graves' version of the myth, the Eurydice figure behaves a little bit like Persephone in descending and then reascending in a cyclical manner to and from the underworld. The serpent, she warms at her thighs, records the serpent that killed Eurydice, must do, but it also evokes Eve's serpent, I suppose, and it's clearly some sort of image of sexual infidelity, which again doesn't fit with Eurydice as we know her. I think that, to me, Graves' poem appears to me to be much more about Orpheus himself. Each of the two sentences that make up the poem begins with an address to himself, right? Blush as you stroke, and then yet you are patient still. So it's two sentences both addressed to himself. As he contemplates his own face, it is her gaze that he evokes, though. She has called it beautiful. You stroke your features, she has called it beautiful. And so the suffering, the scarred face, the patience, are in effect what he desires and yearns for. I don't think it's too much of a reach to look back at Fainlight's Old Man in Love here and see this idea of he seeks destruction in the gaze of love. Maybe it is. We can discuss. The most complete version of the Orpheus and Eurydice story comes from Virgil's Georgics. And most scholars agree that its key moment, the second loss of Eurydice, when Orpheus looks back to her, here is a lovely Pompeian mural in which you can see Orpheus looking back at Eurydice. So most scholars would agree that that key moment, the second loss, is probably Virgil's invention. It didn't really exist before then. In the Georgics, the lovers are parted when Orpheus, seized by a lover's mad desire, and Virgil makes this clear, it's about desire, and heedless therefore of the rule made by Proserpina, turns around to look at Eurydice. Now Graves always professed his dislike of Virgil, whom he called the anti-poet. And so it is perhaps unsurprising that in his remaking of the Orpheus and Eurydice story, he appears to be deaf to a moment when Virgil actually, I think, is at his truest as a poet. This is the, I think the Orpheus episode in the fourth Georgic is perhaps Virgil's greatest achievement as a poet. Virgil here shows his understanding of the power of love as a kind of madness. Eurydice says to Orpheus that it is his furor, his madness in Latin, that is sending her back to the world of the dead. And Virgil reworks this moment in the second book of his Aeneid, when Aeneas, by not looking behind him, loses his wife, Creusa. By not indulging, by being the stoic that he must be, and not indulging in the fury and the madness of love, he loses Creusa. By the way, in the earlier epic cycle, Creusa's name was Eurydice, and Virgil is likely to have known that. And actually, I think Robert Graves is likely to have known it too. So Aeneas loses Creusa / Eurydice in a burning Troy that closely resembles the underworld. Orpheus's failure is truly tragic, especially as it is juxtaposed with the success in the Georgics of Aristeas, the anti-hero, in rehabilitating himself. So the poet fails, but the anti-poet, in fact, in the Georgics, succeeds, even though he is the killer of Eurydice. And the final poem, Eurydice, here. Now, I find this a very difficult poem. George Steiner, who was otherwise impressed, if not awed, by Graves, put it quite well when he criticised the Gravesian reinterpretations of the ancient world as curiously unpoetic. As long as, this is George Steiner I'm quoting, as long as men weigh love against death and know the tragedy of near success, Orpheus's attempt to lead Eurydice back to the light will strike its rich echoes. When Graves assures us that it was actually Eurydice who destroyed men in some ancient serpent rite, our sense of the poetic mutinies even before our reason. And I have some sympathy with that. Now, I don't think that Eurydice is a very good poem. I don't like the rhyming of slank and lank, stank and lank. I think the repetition of chain looks a bit careless. I think the naked imps are just simply too graphic and horrible, and we don't need them. Though I am happy to be persuaded otherwise by people here who know much better than me. The necrophiliac monster who shines here in borrowed light is quite simply, it's too broadly drawn. And I am reminded of the dig that Carol Ann Duffy's Eurydice aims at this kind of thing. Perhaps a useful corrective. This is Carol Ann Duffy's Eurydice. Rest assured, she says, that I would rather speak for myself than be dearest, beloved, dark lady, white goddess, etc., etc. In fact, girls, I'd rather be dead. In Virgil, this is one of the very few episodes of genuine love poetry, I think. It is love as a form of madness that compels Orpheus to look back before they have reached the light, and it is his desire that causes him to disregard the rules, and his severed head keeps on crying out Eurydice's name. This is a triumph for the elegiac. What so-called pessimist readers of Virgil are able to see is that Virgil returns to the darkness and to the tragic failure of the Orpheus episode at all the moments in the Aeneid when he lets the other or the oppressed voices speak. There are a number of them. I've already mentioned the one in the Aeneid too. There's Nisus and Euryalus. There's a number of them. Virgil always, however, takes us back to the shadows of that world at the end of the Aeneid when he acknowledges the failure of epic. So here I believe that Graves misreads Virgil, very likely because he cannot see past his fixation with a monstrous female. And Fainlight's Old Man in Love is placed next to a poem in her book called The Black Goddess. Now, I'm not sure I understand it entirely, and I do think that this poem too offers some criticism of the mood of man does, woman is, not least in the line, an ancient vanity deceives you both, the poet and the Black Goddess. Now, I know this is a weak conclusion, I'm aware of that, but it's a first approach to a complex subject matter, and I thank you for your indulgence.